You have already checked your phone since you started watching this video. Maybe you did it consciously. More likely you did it the way most people do it most of the time, as a reflex, as an automatic movement that was completed before the decision to make it was fully formed. A reach and a glance and a return that happened in the background of whatever else you were doing, leaving almost no trace in conscious awareness except perhaps a faint residue of dissatisfaction because there was nothing there, or a faint residue of stimulation because there was. The average person checks their phone somewhere between 80 and 150 times per day, depending on which study you consult and which population was sampled. That is roughly once every 6 to 12 minutes of waking life. For a significant subset of the population, particularly younger adults, the number is considerably higher. Some studies have documented individuals checking their phones more than 300 times per day. These numbers are not simply statistics about technology use. They are behavioral data about the operation of one of the most powerful psychological systems in the human brain, a system that was not designed to handle anything like what the smartphone has placed in front of it. Understanding why you cannot stop checking your phone requires understanding three things: what the phone is actually providing at a neurological level every time you check it, why that provision is structured in the specific way it is, and how that structure exploits features of the human reward system that evolved for entirely different purposes, and why the standard explanations for phone checking, boredom, habit, social anxiety, fear of missing out are all partially correct, but collectively miss something more fundamental about what is actually happening. Let's begin with the neuroscience. The psychologist Kent Berridge at the University of Michigan has made what is arguably the most important distinction in the modern science of motivation: the distinction between wanting and liking. These two words sound like they should describe the same thing, or at least closely related things. We want things we like. We pursue things that give us pleasure. But Berridge's research has revealed that wanting and liking are, at a neurochemical level, completely separate systems that can operate independently and that are driven by different neurochemical mechanisms. Liking, in Berridge's framework, is the experience of pleasure itself, the subjective enjoyment of a reward in the moment of experiencing it. Liking is mediated primarily by opioid systems in the brain, the same systems involved in the pain-relieving effects of opioid drugs. When you eat something delicious, or experience physical affection, or hear music that moves you, the opioid system produces the subjective experience of pleasure that you call liking. Wanting, by contrast, is the motivational drive toward a reward, the urge, the craving, the pull that directs behavior toward the pursuit of something anticipated. Wanting is mediated primarily by the dopamine system, and the crucial insight from Berridge's research is that the dopamine system does not primarily encode pleasure. It encodes anticipation, prediction, and the motivation to seek. This distinction matters enormously for understanding phone checking, because the dopamine system does not require the actual delivery of reward to activate. It activates in response to cues that predict the possible delivery of reward. And it activates most powerfully not when reward is certain, but when reward is uncertain. The neuroscientist Wolfram Schultz at the University of Cambridge conducted a series of experiments with primates that have become foundational in the science of motivation. Schultz trained primates to expect a reward after a specific cue and measured the firing of dopamine neurons throughout the process. His initial finding was that dopamine neurons fired in response to the reward itself, but as the animals learned the association between the cue and the reward, something changed. The dopamine response shifted from the reward to the cue. The neurons fired not when the reward arrived, but when the cue predicted that the reward might arrive. More strikingly still, when Schultz omitted the expected reward after the cue, dopamine neuron firing dropped below baseline. The absence of the predicted reward produced a negative dopamine signal that was, in a neurochemical sense, worse than the neutral state that preceded the cue. And when he introduced an unpredictable element, delivering the reward only sometimes after the cue, rather than every time, the dopamine response was significantly stronger than it was when the reward was delivered reliably every time. Uncertainty amplified the dopamine signal. This finding, which has been extensively replicated across species and contexts, is the neurobiological foundation of what psychologists call the variable ratio reinforcement schedule, the phenomenon first identified by B.F. Skinner in his work with animals in the 1950s and 1960s. Skinner found that behaviors reinforced on a variable ratio schedule, meaning the reward comes after an unpredictable number of responses rather than a fixed number, are the most resistant to extinction and the most compulsively performed of any reinforcement schedule. The slot machine is the classic example. You pull the lever, and sometimes you win, and sometimes you do not, and the unpredictability of the outcome is precisely what makes the behavior so compulsive. The behavioral psychologist B.J. Fogg at Stanford University, whose work on persuasive technology has become foundational in the design of digital products, coined the term captology to describe the study of computers as persuasive technologies specifically designed to change human attitudes and behaviors. Fogg and his students have documented in detail how the variable ratio reinforcement schedule is built into the fundamental architecture of the smartphone and its applications. Every time you check your phone, you are pulling the lever. Sometimes there is something there, a message that produces warmth or excitement, or the satisfying sense of being thought of, a piece of news that feels important, a notification that someone has responded to something you said, a piece of content in your social media feed that makes you laugh or feel something or learn something, and sometimes there is nothing there. The feed has not updated, nobody has messaged, the notifications are trivial, but you do not know in advance which it will be. And this uncertainty, this variable ratio structure, produces exactly the dopamine response that Schultz's research documented. The cue of the phone, its presence in your pocket or on your desk or on the table beside you, becomes associated through repeated experience with the possibility of reward. And the possibility of reward, particularly uncertain reward, is what activates the wanting system. You reach for the phone, not because you expect something specific to be there, but because you cannot be certain that something is not there. The technology writer and former Google design ethicist, Tristan Harris, has argued in his public advocacy work on the ethical design of technology that the variable ratio reinforcement schedule was not accidentally built into smartphone applications. It was deliberately engineered. The social media platforms, messaging applications, and content algorithms that occupy most of the time people spend on their phones were designed by teams of engineers and behavioral scientists whose explicit objective was to maximize engagement and who understood that variable ratio reinforcement was the most powerful tool available for that purpose. Harris's account of the deliberate engineering of compulsive behavior has been disputed by some technology companies, who argue that their products are designed to be enjoyable rather than addictive in any clinical sense. But the behavioral evidence is difficult to dismiss. The average American now spends somewhere between 4 and 6 hours per day on their smartphone, with the figure rising each year. The behavioral profile of smartphone use, frequent checking, difficulty reducing use despite intention to do so, use continuing despite negative consequences, anxiety when access is restricted, maps onto clinical criteria for behavioral addiction in ways that researchers have increasingly noted. The psychologist Larry Rosen at California State University Dominguez Hills has spent more than 3 decades studying the psychology of technology use and has proposed what he calls the iDisorder hypothesis, the idea that many people have developed a relationship with their technology that has features of recognized psychiatric disorders, including obsessive-compulsive disorder, attention deficit disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and anxiety disorders. Rosen's research has found that many people experience what he calls phantom vibration syndrome, the perception that a phone is vibrating when it is not, which he interprets as evidence that the anticipatory checking behavior has become so deeply conditioned that the checking is triggered not only by actual phone signals, but by the internal expectation of them. The nervous system has learned to expect the phone's signals so reliably that it begins generating the expectation of signals independently of any actual signal. The social psychologist Sherry Turkle at MIT, who has spent decades studying the relationship between technology and human identity, has made a different but complementary argument in her 2015 book Reclaiming Conversation: The Power of Talk in a Digital Age. Turkle argues that compulsive phone checking is not simply a product of variable ratio reinforcement or deliberately engineered persuasive technology. It is a response to the social and psychological vulnerabilities that the smartphone both exploits and creates. Turkle documents that many people use their phones compulsively, not primarily in search of positive reward, but in avoidance of negative states. The phone offers a reliable escape from the discomfort of silence, from the anxiety of unstructured time, from the challenge of difficult conversations that require full attention, from the experience of being alone with one's thoughts, in a way that many people find increasingly unfamiliar and uncomfortable. In a series of interviews and observational studies, Turkle found that many people cannot tolerate being alone without their phone for more than a few minutes, not because the phone is delivering positive rewards, but because the absence of the phone has become associated with a specific kind of uncomfortable emptiness that the phone reliably fills. This finding connects to research on what psychologists call experiential avoidance, the tendency to avoid internal experiences, thoughts, feelings, sensations that are perceived as negative or aversive. The psychologist Stephen Hayes at the University of Nevada Reno, who developed acceptance and commitment therapy, has documented that experiential avoidance is one of the most powerful drivers of compulsive behavior across a wide range of contexts, and that behaviors maintained by avoidance are typically more resistant to change than behaviors maintained by the pursuit of positive reward. The phone, in this framework, functions as what Hayes would call an avoidance behavior, a behavior that provides temporary relief from internal discomfort, but that does so at the cost of reinforcing the perception that the discomfort is intolerable without the avoidance. Every time you reach for your phone to escape boredom or anxiety or social awkwardness or the discomfort of your own thoughts, you are reinforcing the belief that those states require escape and strengthening the association between discomfort and phone use. The neuroscientist and addiction researcher Nora Volkow, director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, has been cautious about applying the clinical concept of addiction to smartphone use, noting that the term should be reserved for behaviors that involve compulsive use despite significant negative consequences, and that engage the same neurobiological systems as substance addiction. But she has also noted that the neurobiological systems engaged by smartphone use, particularly the dopamine systems involved in the wanting and anticipation of variable rewards, are the same systems that are dysregulated in substance addiction, and that this overlap warrants serious scientific attention. The most systematic attempt to measure the degree to which smartphone use meets clinical criteria for behavioral addiction has been the work of researchers using what they call the problematic mobile phone use scale and related instruments. Studies using these instruments have consistently found that somewhere between 6 and 10% of adults show patterns of smartphone use that meet criteria for problematic or addictive use, with higher rates among younger adults and adolescents. But the more interesting finding from this literature is not the percentage who meet clinical criteria, but the degree to which the behavioral mechanisms involved in compulsive phone checking, variable ratio reinforcement, dopamine-driven wanting, experiential avoidance, are present in virtually all smartphone users, rather than only in the subset who meet clinical criteria for addiction. The mechanisms are universal. The degree to which they produce functional impairment varies. The evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar at Oxford University, famous for his work on the relationship between social group size and neocortex volume in primates, Dunbar's number, has proposed that the compulsive social monitoring that smartphone use enables is continuous with a much older and more fundamental human drive, the drive to monitor the social landscape for information about one's standing in the group, about threats and opportunities in the social environment, about what others are doing and thinking and feeling. Human beings are, in Dunbar's account, social obsessives. The capacity for social monitoring, for tracking the behavior and mental states of other group members, was one of the primary selection pressures that drove the expansion of the human brain. We are designed to be interested in what other people are doing. We are designed to find social information compelling, and the smartphone delivers social information, or the anticipation of social information, in a continuous stream that is unprecedented in human evolutionary history. The ancestral environment in which the social monitoring drive evolved was a small group of perhaps 150 people, Dunbar's number, whose social relationships were stable and slow-moving. The information about what those people were doing was available through direct observation and face-to-face conversation. The quantity of social information available at any given moment was bounded by what could be perceived directly. The smartphone delivers an unbounded stream of social information from hundreds or thousands of people, updated in real time, curated by algorithms designed to maximize engagement, and available at any moment. The social monitoring system, designed for a world in which social information was scarce and slow, is confronted with a world in which social information is abundant and instantaneous, and it responds the way any system responds when it is given unlimited access to the resource it was designed to acquire. It cannot stop. You are not weak for checking your phone. You are not undisciplined. You are not failing at something that most people manage easily. You are a social organism with a brain designed for a world that no longer exists, confronted with a technology that has been engineered by teams of behavioral scientists to exploit every feature of that brain as efficiently as possible. The phone wins not because you are losing. It wins because the game was designed by people who understood the rules of your brain better than you do, and knowing that does not solve the problem. But it is the only place from which a solution can begin.
Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you find this video interesting, please consider subscribing for more content like this.